morning, afternoon, or evening, or whatever time it is for you guys today, and welcome back to today's video. So in today's video, we are going to be learning to understand the difference between summative and formative assessment. We're going to understand why we assess students. And again, the leading principle for this lecture is principle number 18, which states that formative and summative assessments are both important and useful, but require different approaches and interpretations. So let's talk about what is an assessment. Just do a quick little brief review. All right. So when we talk about an assessment, remember an assessment is the measurement of something. And when we are measuring something, this is going to provide us evidence that we use to evaluate if learning took place. So last time around, we ended with identifying the two different types of assessment for student learning. So we had assessment for learning, but we also had assessment of learning, all right? So when we talk about assessment for learning, this is going to be where assessment is an integral part of the teaching learning process, and it means that it's a continual ongoing process designed to both support and to increase student learning. On the other hand, we have assessment of learning. So this is going to occur at the end of the unit or the course of study, and it's designed to determine how much students have learned. So a lot of the times when we talk about assessment for learning, we can talk about formative assessment. Your book also mentions pre-instructional assessment. I'm not going to focus on that in this lecture. However, please note that your book does talk about that, and you might be asked a question on that on, say, an exam, etc. So we're going to focus our attention on both formative and summative assessment because, again, we are using our principle to lead our conversation today, and our principle is focusing in on formative and summative assessments. So let's talk about the difference between formative and summative assessments. So when we talk about formative assessments, this is the collection of formal and informal processes teachers and students use to gather evidence for the purpose of informing their next step in learning. Again, the purpose of formative assessment is so that we can practice, so that practice occurs during the learning environment while the students are still practicing and improving. So let's go back to talk about nut Hall's, excuse me, 3 times rule, right? So remember that rule is that we need to engage in the material 3 times before we are tested over it. Part of that is because we are still practicing, we're still improving our knowledge during formative assessment. So before I provide some examples of formative assessment, what are some examples of formative assessment that you can think of? Go ahead and pause, answer that question, and then come back. So some examples of formative assessment can include, but I will also give a caveat that these are by no means the extent. It's just a couple of examples that we're going to look at. Exit tickets. So at the end of the class, you can ask your students to write down 2 questions that you have remaining from the lecture. You can ask them 2 things that you learned from the lecture, right? So the exit tickets could occur at the end of the class, but not necessarily at the end of the unit, right? So it's the end of the class, and most of the time you are covering materials or covering a topic multiple days in a class. So when we talk about exit tickets, yes, they occur at the end of the class, but it's not the end of the unit or end of the topic before you give like an exam on it, okay? You could give you could give, you could give exams, not exams, you could give quizzes. I have exams on my mind. You could give quizzes during class as well. Some of them could be think, pair, share. So a think, pair, share is generally where you ask students to think individually for about a minute or so, depending upon the complexity of the topic that was posed. Could be a little longer, could be a little shorter. Once they think individually, you then ask them to pair up with a classmate, and then they talk among themselves. It could be seeing what was similar, what was different. Did they have different viewpoints? So they talk with one another, again, generally a minute, maybe 5 minutes, depending upon the level of conversation. And then they share out to the entire class. So that is a think, pair, share. You could also do a 1-minute paper. So a 1-minute paper would be similar to an exit ticket in terms of it's happening at the end. But you're asking them to just write down what they had learnt over the course of the instruction for that day. It's a quick summary of that lesson. Again, it's not going to be very detailed, but just a quick summary of that lesson. We can also do classroom discussions. When we think about formative assessment, there is a lot of responsibility on the teacher. And what I mean by there's a lot of responsibility on the teacher is that it doesn't just have to be something that they turn in, it's a quiz or something like that, but it's also observations. So when we talked about different types of research methodologies, we talked about observation. So observing and monitoring the students learning in the classroom. And doing that observation in the classroom will help inform you what you need to do next. So it could be both formal, so an actual written assignment, but it could also be more informal. Well, you're just doing an observation, and again, like I said before, if you're seeing students have blank stares at you, you might think, okay, I need to go back a few steps and explain that concept there, right? So when we talk about assessment happening during instruction, this is going to allow you to make a lot of different decisions about what to say, what to do, what the next step is, to make sure that the classroom is running smoothly and to make sure that students are going to actively learn. The other thing that we have to think about in terms of teachers for formative assessment is that it does require a lot of listening to students' answers, observing other students to see if they have an understanding or if they have any confusion. We also have to start thinking and framing the next question while they're still answering the next one. We also have to look around the room for other misbehaviors that are going on. So simultaneously, the teacher has to monitor the pace of the activity, the pace of the formative assessment, while also structuring the content, right? One of the ways that teachers can do this is through small group. So the teacher might need to be aware of what each group is doing, but you can give them the ability to work together in a group setting. And then the group can monitor, and we'll talk about why we assess student learning in just a second, but the group can monitor whether or not they have misunderstandings or not, and if they have misunderstandings or confusion or stuck on a problem, they can raise their hand and you can go over to that group, right? So you might be thinking, that is a lot to ask on a teacher. And I would say you're absolutely correct. But why do we want formative assessments to occur? Why do we not want just to have full-on just summative assessment? So you might have encountered a college class where you only have like 4 or 5 exams in the semester and that's it. Those would be all summative assessments, right? So why do I have formative assessments built into my class? And again, part of that is the idea of practice, practice, practice for the principles that we talked about earlier. But the other reason is, again, it allows me to understand where my students' struggles are, and I'm able to help address that right now during instruction where learning is going to take place. We'll come back to this idea when we talk about why we assess in just a little bit. What I want to talk about next is summative assessments, okay? You can think of summative assessment as post-instruction assessment. That's what your book calls them. Or you might have heard these called formal assessment. So when we talk about summative assessments, it is defined as the process of gathering information used to make conclusions about the level of a learner's achievement. So when we think about summative assessment, in contrast to formative assessment, summative assessment is designed to evaluate how much learning has occurred. So formative assessment is designed to increase learning. Summative is to evaluate how much learning has occurred up to that point in time. So I've already talked about exams for summative assessment. So don't use the example of exams for this question. But what are some other examples of summative assessments? Go ahead and pause this video, answer the question, and then come back. Some of the examples that you would have said might have been like a final exam. It might be like a portfolio. It might be a project. I know in my classes, I like to give my students like a project that they have to do in the class, and usually it is at the end of the unit. So this semester, I am teaching child development and adult development. I also teach adolescent development as well. And in each of those classes, I have a different project that they do. Usually the project is around the different units that I have in the class. Sometimes it is a large project at the end of the semester. It could also be a presentation that a student has to give at the end of the semester as well. So depending upon the class that you're looking at, the type of summative assessment might be different. The one that is coming in my mind, for example, is like a music class. You might have a recital at the end of a music class. You usually don't have a recital if we're talking about, say, an English or a history class, right? So again, the type of summative assessment might vary depending upon the class that you will have. Same thing is true for formative assessments as well. When we think of assessment, no matter if it is formative assessment or if it's summative assessment, we need to think about why we assess students in the way that we assess students. And so let's talk about 3 reasons why we assess students. The first one is to increase student learning. And so we see that assessment is going to play an important role in the effort, the engagement, and the performance of students. And we can see that the informal observations that are done in the classroom can provide information about how motivated students are to stay on the subject. So if you have a good relationship with the student, then maybe just asking a direct question in, say, a private conversation can produce valuable insight into the student motivation. And when we're thinking about the link between motivation and assessment, we can ask ourselves if the assessment will encourage students to stay involved in that learning process. So are they more intrinsically motivated or are they more extrinsically motivated? We also see that assessments that are more challenging in nature but fail should increase students' enthusiasm enthusiasm for learning. Excuse me. It's been a long day, and this is the 4th video that I've been recording today. On the other hand, we do see that assessments that are too difficult will lower students' self-esteem, self-efficacy, and will raise their anxiety. So we need to make sure that we're assessing them at a challenging level, but not necessarily at a too difficult level, right? And so again, one of the ways that we can assess whether or not the assessment is too difficult or too easy is to go through multiple formative assessment. If we can see that they are progressing through the formative assessment at an easy pace, then say that assessment that's a little bit more challenging will get them engaged in that learning process more than ones that might be too easy. So when we are thinking about the 3 reasons why we assess students, we can think of it in terms of increasing student learning, increasing learners' motivation, and then the 3rd reason is to increase learners' self-regulation. So when I talk about student self-regulation, this is talking about students monitoring their own learning process. So we want to encourage students to monitor their own process, and that in itself can encourage and increase self-confidence and motivation to learn. So getting students to be more reflective and to monitor their progress is a key aspect of students' self-assessment. So self-monitoring relates to our discussion when we are going to be talking about self-regulation later on in the semester. It will also relate to the concept of metacognition, which is just a fancy term for thinking about thinking, all right? So again, we'll come back to these concepts later on in the semester. But the biggest thing that we have to understand here is that self-assessment is a fundamental skill for self-regulated learning. And one of the biggest challenges that a teacher might face is to incorporate the student's self-assessment into classroom assessment. Now, one of the other biggest challenges to get the students to do it, if you figure out the answer to that, please let me know, right? But one of the things that you can do there is at the end of each class, just get them to reflect on what they learned, to do those exit tickets, to do those 1-minute papers, to do that think, pair, share. All of those are acts in which we can start to think, or students can start to think about what they know, what they have learned, how they're engaging in that learning process. So at the end of the day, when we talk about assessment, we should be really thinking about assessment in terms of both summative and formative assessment. And we have to have both of them in the classroom. We can't just have solely summative. We can't just have solely formative. We had to have a combination of them. Both of them have different purposes, but they are both needed in the classroom. And it's also mandated by the state, by the school district, by the your bosses or the principals at the school, right? So usually we have to have at least some type of summative assessment because we do have to have a grade to enter at the end of the day. We have to give a percentage, we have to give a letter grade to students. So we have to figure out how data is collected to get to that grade at the end of the day. And that will be our discussion in our next video. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I'll see you guys later. Bye.